It's Tuesday, the 20th of December. Welcome to the final Politics Live of 2022. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, Labour's Stella Creasy, Andrew Fisher, Labour's Policy Director during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, and Anita Boateng, a former advisor to the Conservative government. Today.
What we're not willing to do is to open negotiations about pay, and that's because we have an independent pay review body.
And I've got many colleagues that mental health is suffering, patients are suffering, and I want to see a change.
Ministers say they won't budge on pay, so how long will the strikes last? Jeremy Clarkson says he's horrified after his offensive comments about Meghan Markle trigger over 17,000 complaints to the press regulator. Stella Creasy says this shows the government should make misogyny a hate crime.
The truth is that if we vote to leave, we'll be in an economically stronger position.
We will prosper and flourish and thrive as never before if we leave the European Union.
Brexit was meant to make us better off, but is it working?
Hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future.
2022 has been a year of political upsets, but what will surprise us in 2023? Let's start with the strikes. It's the second day that the nurses are taking action and ambulance drivers are expected to go on strike tomorrow. Let's have a look at some front pages. The Daily Mail has Rishi, I won't back down over strikes. This is The Guardian's front page. Ambulance strike threatens lives of 999 patients, warn NHS bosses. And finally, the FT, crisis talks with ambulance leaders as nurses threaten 6 months of strikes. The crisis talks are with the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, who's due to meet the unions to discuss emergency cover for the strike by ambulance drivers tomorrow, not pay. So the government's not budging, it says. My question to open the programme, starting with you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is so how long will the strikes last?
Well, I obviously don't know, but we are getting to the point where we should be starting the discussions on next year's pay as well, because this discussion is all about pay from April of 2022, and the pay review body started its work in February of 2022. We should now be looking to 2023 when we've got the inflation figures already. We know what the situation is, and I think there's an opportunity to work on a settlement for next year, which takes into the facts of inflation that we've now had.
Are you expecting months of strikes?
Oh, and I don't know. I don't think strikes are the right way to go about this. But I think there are problems in the NHS. Before coming here, I cut out some things. Actually, I tore out, to be accurate, some things from The Sun, which I think is extraordinary about what's happening in the NHS. So you've got 20 directors of lived experience on jobs of up to £115,000 a year and £100,000 on lecturing doctors on how to correctly address pregnant trans men. And then they had a comment column saying a 74-year-old man, the father of one of their columnists, was asked if he was pregnant. Now, if you are wasting money on silly things, you're not going to have enough money to pay the nurses. And we're spending £170 billion on the health service. It employs 1.2 billion people, and it is not delivering the service people expect.
Stella?
That is a fundamental problem.
Yeah.
How long do you think the strikes will last?
Jacob, you can dog whistle all you want. You were part of a government that wrote off £10 billion worth of PPE by the poor management of contracts. I tell you what strikes me, Joe. This weekend I was at a food bank that was doing a collection for the nurses at my local hospital that was being supported by our local firefighters who were also doing a collection for their staff. These are people we expect to keep us well, keep us safe. And this pay review body took data from the government, it took direction from the government from December last year about what inflation would be like. So it's all very well, Jacob, absolutely we should be looking at the pay for next year, but we also need to look at the pay now because it was based on the idea that inflation would be at 2%. And rather than this
I think they took into account higher inflation levels than that, because it was by the time they gave the review, their recommendation, it was more like February, March.
No, the data from the government was... Well, and if we look at inflation rates since then, they've gone up further.
Absolutely.
So there is absolutely... the nurses say they want to negotiate. The government could play an honest broker role here and get people around a table to actually talk about what the pay should be, given the evidence on inflation. And instead you're trying to dog whistle and, of course, bring in that old Schlibberlist trans people.
No,
Jacob, the nurses deserve better.
It's actually getting to the point of fundamental reform, and Wes Streeting, I think, has been very helpful on this, having a senior Labour politician pointing out that the National Health Service is not perfect. What is needed, and there's an excellent Secretary of State in the form of Steve Barclay, is getting the reforms in that make sure the enormous amount of money that is spent on the health service is spent more effectively, so that people get the treatment that they need when they need it, and indeed that nurses get paid what is necessary.
Was it like the £10 billion then that you wasted on PPE contracts?
This is a complete
Because that's
red
about
herring.
good procurement, isn't it, Jake? No, I'd be with you about good procurement skills. That's what Wes is talking about. He's not talking about silly dog whistle stories from the Sun newspaper.
The Labour Party's position...
There's some serious work that needs to go on here.
The Labour Party's position on PPE is complete humbug. I was leader of the House at the time, and week after week I was being asked, why haven't we got more PPE? The government then bought it at the point everyone in the world wanted PPE.
But are you saying there hasn't been any money wasted, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
No,
I mean, there was. So if you're raising the issue of waste, then it can be countered with other examples of waste.
We need to reduce waste in the NHS, but PPE had to be bought and had to be bought urgently.
I'm going to come back to you two in just a moment. How long do you think the strikes will last? The government says it's not going to budge on pay. Jacob Rees-Mogg pretty well saying the same. So how long will they go on?
If it doesn't budge on pay, then we won't see any resolution of the crisis within the NHS, because part of the reason we've got these massive backlogs in the NHS is because we've got massive staff shortages. We've got massive staff shortages in paramedics and in nurses. I think there are 46,000 nurse vacancies within the NHS. Last year, more nurses left the profession than in any other year in recorded history. 1 in 9 left. That rises to 1 in 6 around district nursing. I've just written a column on this. It's in a real crisis state, and unless you pay people more, you won't recruit and retain the nurses you've got. So
how much more, Andrew? I mean, if the nurses are asking for 19%, they say that's 5% above the retail price index. Labour and the government say that's unaffordable.
Well, that's not unaffordable. It's about... Politics is always about choices. For example, if you cut the stamp duty cut that the government have just brought in, that would pay for a 19% pay rise for all of the 300,000 nurses in the NHS. So it's perfectly affordable.
And you do it for other workers as well, all other workers that are on strike.
Well, look, it's a subject to negotiation, and I suspect the RCM will negotiate a different rate and we'll come down somewhere in the middle. I suspect that's how negotiations tend to work. But if it's worth saying that the RCN's demand only takes nurses back in real terms to where they were in 2010. So this is not asking for the earth, it's asking for nurses to be paid in real terms what they were in 2010.
Anita, how long do you think the strikes will go on for?
Well, I hope they resolve very, very quickly, because the reality of the situation is that when nurses strike, and this has not happened before, that patients are impacted. And I think that that's partly the reason why in the public sector you do strike, but it does mean very serious consequences for even planned and unplanned activity that takes place in the NHS. But the reality of the situation is the government has to make tough choices. And I think there's no one that can pretend there aren't choices. And we spend sort of 46% of all of NHS spending is on staff and pay. And the reality of the situation is that the more money you spend on nurses or on any other pay, it's less for equipment, it's less for doctors, it's less for, all the things, all the new technologies and the new medicines that people need. These are tough choices. And the government, I think, its intention is in the right place in kind of saying, look, you're looking for 19, maybe it's 15. There are disputes about what inflation might do next year. But that doesn't feel affordable when we're looking at the levels of backlog that the country currently faces and the needs of the NHS on a day-to-day basis.
Briefly and specifically, solution to resolve these strikes. We went off a few tangents earlier, but a solution.
I think the solution is that this pay negotiation is for last April. We will have a new pay review board for next April, and that should take it into account, because we have had this rise in inflation that hadn't started.
Yeah, but should it meet inflation?
Fully by last April.
If you've raised it, should it meet inflation?
I think it needs to tie in with an overall reform, but I do accept that if you don't have all the nurses' posts filled, part of that will be because of pay, and there is an issue on pay bands, because nurses used to get increments within their band, but 43% are at the top of their band and therefore can't get that. So,
but with reform, just to be clear, with reform, you would like to see a significant pay rise for nurses, because you'd agree that nurses are, in particular, justified in blaming the government for the state of their living standards, which have either been declining or stagnating since 2010.
Well, that's not necessarily true for individual nurses.
No, but I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking broadly.
That's really important. That was the point I was making about people being at the top of their pay bands. Over the last 12 years, it's been possible for people to rise in the pay bands, but now 43% have reached the top, and they obviously can't. So there is some structural issue which I'm accepting. But, and he is absolutely spot on, the government doesn't have unlimited money. There are choices to be made, and any money spent in one area can't be spent in another area.
I mean, the nurses are on strike in Wales, aren't they, where there is a Labour government, and Mark Drayford, the First Minister, has also said he wouldn't want to raise or use tax-raising powers to fund a further pay rise. What would your solution be?
Well, first of all, governments are perfectly capable of ignoring the pay.
They are.
They have done in the past. Steve Barclay could actually this afternoon talk about pay, look at the data now about inflation and go, actually, where is the negotiation? Because there is a negotiation to be done here. Actually, some of the other settlements have been close to 7.5%. You want to find more money in the NHS? Finally grab the issue that is the PFI contracts. That means that 1 in every £4 we're putting into the... Your government has had 12 years and several attempts by people like me to try and get them to sort this out, and they haven't. That's 1 in £4 that are going... So do you agree with me? Do you agree with me then? We should, because we're spending 1 in £4 is going to the private sector.
I was never in favour of Labour's obsession with PFIs.
2023, that's our pledge, isn't it?
But once you've made a contract, you can't just unilaterally break it.
Absolutely,
Governments
you can,
can't do
because
that.
of the corporation tax variations in them. There's a way to do it. In fact, your government has been trying to renegotiate them. It just hasn't gone fast enough on doing that. So we could do that. We could save the NHS some money.
Very bad contracts were signed by the last Labour government. It's good to have that on the record.
Let's move on. We're going to talk about Jeremy Clarkson. Let me just show you this BBC News headline. Jeremy Clarkson says he is horrified over Meghan column. This is a column that he wrote about the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, in The Sun newspaper on Friday. Now, in order to tell the story, I'm going to read part of his column, which the whole column's been removed, but I have to warn viewers the language he used is offensive. He says, Meghan, though, is a different story. I hate her. Not like I hate Nicola Sturgeon or Rose West. I hate her on a cellular level. At night, I'm unable to sleep as I lie there, grinding my teeth and dreaming of the day when she is made to parade naked through the streets of every town in Britain while the crowds chant shame and throw lumps of excrement at her. He tweeted this yesterday. Oh, dear. I've rather put my foot in it in a column I wrote about Meghan. I made a clumsy reference to a scene in Game of Thrones, and this has gone down badly with a great many people. I'm horrified to have caused so much hurt, and I shall be more careful in future. In fact, I think it's triggered the largest number of complaints to the regulator, 17,500. Your reaction, Stella?
Well, actually, what's important about that is the bit beforehand, because he talks about this in the context of a whole series of women that he finds objectionable. And his answer to her feeling objectionable is to encourage the abuse and harassment of them. Now, to be clear, when we've had other forms of hatred, what we've done is said, actually, that drives crimes. Misogyny is driving crimes against women, and we've recognised that in our hate crime legislation. So it's not to create a new crime, it's not to make misogyny an offence, it's to recognise that where it is driving crimes, like abuse, like harassment, then sentences should reflect that. And the cultural impact that's had is very clear. I am middle-aged now. I remember things being on television in my younger years that we would now recognise as deeply racist and creating an environment where racial hatred and abuse can flourish that then leads to criminal offences. It's time to do the same thing about misogyny, because 51% of our country puts their keys in their hands before they go out at night, checks their routes. When crimes happen to them, people say, well, what were you wearing? Were you wearing your headphones? Were you looking where you were going? Why were you out at night? We treat women differently, and this kind of behaviour, this kind of language creates the culture in which that is permissible. And
you're convinced that a new law is necessary to tackle it?
Well, right now, targeting people on the basis of their sex or gender isn't actually recognised in law. There is a law going through Parliament right now about public harassment that will be the start of that.
Street harassment.
And that is No, it's actually about public harassment, and this is a really important thing to pick out, because the first one, what it would do is learn from the police in this country. 11 police forces already record where a crime is motivated by hatred of someone's sex or gender, and that is driving a cultural change both within our police and also how seriously they deal with this. When 2/3 of women report experiencing harassment on a daily basis, but they don't report it, the problem isn't with the women coming forward. The problem is the environment and the system that doesn't take it seriously enough.
Your reaction to the story in itself, and then the response that Stella has outlined, that there has to be a change in the law to tackle this and make it more serious?
I think any harassment or violence against women ought to be treated severely by the law, and violence against men, that we have laws to protect people from violence and harassment, and they should be used and enforced. I think one should always be careful about assuming that the solution is a new law, that there are lots of laws, and the question is, are we using them? And are police processes the right processes to ensure that they are being used? As regards the column, I'm afraid what Mr. Clarkson says is indefensible. I'm not going to try and defend it, and it's unpleasant. I mean, that's what he does. That's how he's made his reputation, is by saying things that shock. But he himself has admitted that he's gone much too far on this occasion and said something deeply unpleasant.
Except that I will get you to respond just in a second. I mean, Caroline Nokes, your colleague, the Conservative MP, she's also chair of the Equalities Committee in Parliament. She is calling on The Sun to take action against Jeremy Clarkson. Let's just show you a bit of the letter. It's been signed, I think, by 60 other MPs. Enough is enough. We cannot allow this type of behaviour to go unchecked any longer. We welcome The Sun's retraction of the article. We now demand action is taken against Mr Clarkson and an unreserved apology is issued to Ms Markle immediately. We further demand definitive action is taken to ensure no article like this is ever published again. Do you agree with that final sentence? Freedom of speech is very important, but I do not think it is wise of newspapers to publish articles like this. I'm not in favour of politicians deciding what is or isn't put in newspapers, but I don't think it's wise to put things like this into newspapers.
Do you accept, though, that when people shout racial abuse from the terraces, something should be done about that? So when we have an environment where we say that using those kind of words from the terraces, it's right that football clubs throw those people out, it's right that we see that as a serious matter. Because we already do recognise where words create a context in which violence and harassment happen.
Absolutely. I think if words lead to violence, that is already illegal under existing law. I think it's very hard to believe that what Clarkson is saying will lead to people throwing things at the Duchess of Sussex. So I don't think this is an incitement to violence, but I think it is very unpleasant.
So what do you think does incite violence against women then? What culture, what language, what ways of talking, depicting and defining women do you think make a difference? Because we all recognise free speech also means that you can't shout fire in a crowd.
That's absolutely right, and these things are always nuanced. There is a line. This doesn't seem to me to be saying that people should actually do this. This is something that he has a fantasy about, and it may be very unpleasant, but I wouldn't make somebody's...
So how many fantasies do we have to put up with as women about violence and abuse towards us before you recognise that maybe it's causing a culture in which that behaviour is more likely?
I think Jeremy Clarkson could equally have said something unpleasant about a man. Jeremy Clarkson says controversial things.
About lots of women in that article. He mentioned several women. It was about women.
He didn't say something about a man in that article. But crimes against women are crimes, and they should be enforced, and the law should treat people equally.
But it does. Hang on. But do you think Caroline Nokes and other MPs are wrong then to demand that action is taken so you don't see this sort of article again?
I think they are exercising their freedom of speech to say that these articles shouldn't be printed. I think that is fair enough, but I wouldn't want it to be legislated upon. I wouldn't want politicians deciding what newspapers can print. I think that would be a very bad way to go.
Sorry, just one, because then are you saying that you don't think any hate crime legislation should exist, or just that women shouldn't have the protection of it?
I think that where there is incitement to violence, that should be illegal, as it clearly is.
So there is a gap right now, isn't there, about sex and gender? So your religion, your race, your sexuality are protected, but your sex or gender isn't.
I don't think that's right. I think if you incite violence on any individual, that is a crime. If you wrote a piece saying you should go down the high street and burn people's houses down, that would be a crime. Incitement of violence.
Well, let me hang on. Let me bring that. Do you think it should be a hate crime, specifically misogyny?
I mean, I'm not entirely sure where I end up on this, but I think fundamentally there is such a widespread problem of misogyny. There's such a widespread problem of, and it primarily comes from men, abuse, harassment. It is a daily problem. And a lot of the escalating crimes that we see that come, at the very, very sharp end of behaviour starts with things like abuse and then domestic violence, and we can see the parallels.
So you would see it as a gateway in that sense.
I do think there is a significant problem. I think it is so widespread and so normalised. I think that the legislation is neither necessary nor sufficient, if you see what I mean, to tackling that broader problem of how you end up in a society where people understand from the very beginning that this is not acceptable behaviour. And the challenge, Jeremy Clarkson says he was horrified. I'm not sure by whom, because he wrote it. And secondly, the second point about, the Game of Thrones thing wasn't really the problem. You hate a woman you've probably never met on a cellular level.
Yes.
And you straight up said that publicly. And I'm just like, that is an issue for your therapist, to be honest, not for a column. And I really do think that there is a broader problem in society that this kind of behaviour is not called out enough. And I'm really glad to see the reaction we've had so far. And I can see...
And the Caroline Noakes letter and other MPs writing to the Sun.
Are standing up and saying this is not acceptable. And I think that, the Sun should be able to... We shouldn't be telling the Sun what it can publish. But I think having people say, well, look, we are aware and we don't think this is appropriate. And the Sun has obviously thought very carefully about that, and maybe we'll have different procedures moving forward. I'm not entirely sure that the solution has to be a law, because I do think our norms are changing very, very quickly.
Andrew, should it be a hate crime?
I think misogyny should be a hate crime. I don't think specifically because of this article. What I would say about the article is, look, Jeremy Clarkson is paid to have stupid and hateful opinions in a newspaper that regularly platforms stupid and hateful opinions. In fact, that's mainly the reason The Sun seems to exist. From my understanding of it, it's targeted all kinds of minorities over decades and spews out hate.
It's read by an awful lot of people, of course.
It is, unfortunately, and it's very influential.
So they don't agree, obviously, with your take.
I think what's important, and why Caroline Noakes' letter, I have some uncomfortability with it. I write a column, it goes through an editor, who then takes it to another editor. This wasn't Jeremy Clarkson submitting this. This was The Sun publishing it. That's where the problem is. If Jeremy Clarkson wrote this for any other newspaper, for most other newspapers in this country, normal editors would have said, no, that's unacceptable, and taken that out. The Sun are prepared to publish this. That's the problem. Lots of people have hateful opinions. I think the problem here is The Sun and its editorial policy. But yes, misogyny should be a hate crime for the very same reason we have racially aggravated crime, disability aggravated crime, homophobic crime.
Yes, other protected characteristics.
Yes, exactly. And misogyny, there is a gap there. Stella is absolutely right on that.
All right, we're going to talk about Brexit, which you may be relieved about or not. You heard in the headlines Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Let's see if we can get a note of agreement at any point. In the headlines, claiming Brexit would make us better off. So while we're looking back at a little bit of Brexit history, it's almost 2 years since Boris Johnson gave a Christmas Eve press conference extolling the virtues of a trade deal with the EU. Let's have a listen.
I'm very pleased to tell you this afternoon that we have completed the biggest trade deal yet, worth £660 billion a year, a comprehensive Canada-style free trade deal between the UK and the EU, a deal that will protect jobs across this country, a deal that will allow goods, UK goods and components to be sold without tariffs and without quotas in the EU market, a deal which will, if anything, allow our companies and our exporters to do even more business with our European friends.
Christmas Eve 2020. Was it everything you'd hoped for, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Was what? The deal with the EU?
And Brexit, yes.
Brexit. Yes, Brexit is absolutely a great opportunity.
We've had it for 2 years, so...
We're now in charge of our own laws. Democracy is now in charge of our country. That is of fundamental importance. We no longer have our rules made by people who are being bribed by foreign governments.
But I said it's been
quite a good step forward.
Well, it's been 2 years. Well, let's investigate that, because it's been 2 years.
It's quite interesting to investigate, because the Belgians are investigating, what was it, €1.5 million found in used notes in an MEP's house.
Yeah, but let's not deflect. Hang on, you two. I let you take this off on a tangent at the beginning, but we're going to stick with the choreography here on Brexit to investigate whether or not it's been a success on your terms or even on Stella's terms, as well as, of course, you two. Let's talk about, though, the impact on the economy, because, as you know, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which your government set up, published its analysis alongside the government's autumn statement quite recently, saying the latest evidence suggests that Brexit has had a significant adverse impact on UK trade via reducing both overall trade volumes and the number of trading relationships between UK and EU firms. You think it's set the UK free. The impact on the economy, though, doesn't look good.
Well, I would dispute what the ABR says, as a lot of other economists do. I don't think the ABR is the organisation that gets everything right. None of its forecasts have been right.
But this isn't a forecast. The forecast, I take you, but this is saying this is what's happening right here and now.
But the forecasts are important, because if you have a body that comes up with useless forecasts, why should you assume it's Holy Writ when it gives its view of the past? So I wouldn't attach that much to the
now?
ABR.
It's saying it's had a significant adverse effect on UK trade.
Brexit has been a tremendous and remains a tremendous opportunity. Free trade deals were being voted on with Australia and New Zealand last week. This free trade is the greatest economic boon, and we can remove and
Although Brexiteer colleague of yours, George Eustace, didn't agree on the Australia trade deal. He thought that was a rubbish deal.
Well, that's because he was representing, and this is back to the Corn Laws, it's a very similar argument. He was representing the agricultural interest and feels that tariffs are a good idea for the agricultural sector,
but you're
which I fundamentally disagree with.
As you say, you go against the OBR, but it's also the Bank of England. Governor Andrew Bailey says there is another of your favourite institutions from leaving the EU, including a long-run downshift in the level of productivity. It's not an impact we're surprised by.
The productivity issue long predates Brexit. We have had a productivity issue going back to about 1990, and that's a really interesting and serious issue.
And is Brexit making it better or worse?
Well, it depends what the causes of the productivity problem are. I think one of them was the free movement of labour and having low-skilled, cheap labour come in, which meant that business didn't invest in capital and therefore didn't get productivity gains.
Except that there are huge labour shortages now, and net migration levels are at a record high at 504,000. So which bit exactly?
So the issue there was the access of cheap, unskilled labour a reason why people didn't invest in capital, leading to lower productivity.
All right.
Why would that only affect the UK? Germany and France had freedom of movement and still have freedom of movement and have much higher levels of productivity.
Bear in mind that they staggered the free movement from people from Eastern Europe, and the German
had it ever since.
Yes, but they staggered it for the first few years. So, but I'm talking about productivity from 1990. So they had the first few years when it didn't happen, and there may be other reasons as well. I'm not saying this is the exclusive reason, and I don't think that. Well, I think it's part of the reason that why productivity hasn't grown.
I still don't quite know. But just to come back to the sort of the principle, let's go back to first principles. For whatever the sort of historic background that you are setting out, has Brexit boosted economic growth in the UK since Christmas Eve 2020?
Well, it's very difficult to tell because we've had COVID. So the economic data are relatively unclear about what has caused various effects. But Brexit provides this opportunity. So,
all right.
But we need to go through this. So we've got the opportunity to get rid of Solvency II, which is worth £100 billion to the economy. We've got a new procurement bill coming.
We have. Well, look,
to the Commons in January.
And the viewers have heard it, and I will come back to you. But let me just hear from the others. Do you think that Brexit has actually boosted economic growth and productivity?
I feel sorry for Jacob because he has to keep arguing that black is white in order to justify. He's absolutely right that the economy had a lot of long-standing challenges. Brexit was the thing that's held us below the line because we are the only G7 country. Jacob, I listened to you and I listened to you trying to say, we can't tell it's a pandemic. We're the only country post-pandemic that hasn't recovered in the G7. The figures from the OBR are deeply depressing. But more than that, you've dismissed the Bank of England, you've dismissed the statisticians, you've dismissed the farmers. I suggest you go and talk to the small businesses in your local...
The farmers have a particular interest.
The farmers are quite important. I mean, I'm going to sit here and defend the NFU, which understandably thought they were being offered one thing with Brexit and now has seen something completely different.
So you think Brexit has made us worse off?
Yes, absolutely. I think that Brexit, it won't surprise you, I'm the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. I think both that Brexit does not have any opportunities, it only comes with problems. What we need to do is get on now and solve those problems, because actually whether you're arguing to rejoin any more than arguing it's all peace and love isn't doing justice to the people right now struggling. And I talk to businesses in my local community who have reams and reams of paperwork, and that's why exports are down a third. I talk to musicians who just can't tour anymore because it's not worth it. I talk to people who are missing out of jobs because of the professional qualifications issues. There are lots of very practical things now we just have to get on and sort out because this government has made such a hash of Brexit in of itself.
Do you agree with that?
No, I think that the very worst predictions of Brexit haven't happened. The very best predictions of Brexit, we're not there yet. And I think the challenges our economy faces are huge and fundamental, things like productivity, things like recovery from the pandemic. And I think that Brexit is slightly a distraction from some of those huge problems in our economy and some of the things that we need. So I would say that Brexit was neither going to be this magical thing that was going to turn around our economy, nor was it going to be this perilous disaster. And I think there are some pragmatic things like Solvency II where you can see advantages. I think the fact that the public is in general more supportive of immigration and on skills is a positive thing for our economy. So I can see those benefits. I think there definitely have been challenges around particularly Northern Ireland. We can all talk about it. So I think that in a way we get too hung up on the issue of like Brexit good or bad and not on
on the economy.
I mean,
I'm trying to focus this on whether it's made us better or worse off, because that was the metric set by Michael Gove and Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg and others, that we would be better off. Has it made us better off or worse off in these 2 years?
Worse off, and all the evidence shows us that. But I think it is right to say that there are other things that have had a bigger impact since Brexit, like the pandemic, like the inflation caused by spiking oil prices and so on, and the government's failure, not just this government, but successive governments, to invest at a level that other countries in Europe do invest at. There are low levels of investment in the UK. I don't think that's linked to migration, as Jacob says, because other countries have high levels of migration and also invest higher in their economies. We've also driven down wages, which means consumer demand is much lower than it is in other countries. So there are all kinds of reasons why our economy is doing badly. Brexit is one of those reasons. I don't think it's necessarily the chief one. I think having a better relationship with Europe would boost our trade, would boost our growth, might even have an impact on wages. But it's not the sole reason why we're in a terrible state at the moment.
Right, well, I mean, 2 people who disagree with you, Stella, and Andrew are Jeremy Hunt and Sir Keir Starmer, because they have said repeatedly, in fact, recently, that Brexit won't do us any economic harm. Let's have a look.
What I don't accept is the premise that Brexit will make us poorer.
Would membership of the single market boost economic growth?
No, at this stage I don't think it would, and there's no case for going back to the EU or going back into the single market.
What I don't accept is that the long-term impact of that decision will be to make us poorer. Quite the opposite.
We're now outside the EU, outside the single market. The question now is, do we reopen all of that, which I think won't help the economy?
Do you agree with Keir Starmer?
Actually, yes, I do, because he's not saying the same thing there as Jeremy Hunt. What he's saying is that years and years of renegotiation at this point in time would be a long distraction. Actually, what we need to do is... I mean, I want to help...
But he broadly doesn't say Brexit's done the UK any economic harm.
No, he did.
He says we won't rejoin the single market, wouldn't boost our economic growth.
You have to unpick out whether there's harm, and everyone's been very clear that how this government has approached Brexit, from what you do about it. And I'm saying I agree at this point in time now, the onus is on what can we do now. So, for example, we in the Labour Movement for Europe have been pushing for us to look at the pan-European...
But Stella, you said Brexit's done us harm, and Keir Starmer very clearly said there that rejoining the single market and leaving the EU hasn't done the UK any...
Sorry,
well, that
Joe,
is the conclusion of what we've just heard Keir Starmer say. Otherwise, he'd be saying,
those two things
let's
out,
rejoin.
No, because it's not on the cards. Europe thinks that we are... I mean, you can understand from their perspective. They've had 7 years of us being like Jacob. They're sick of us. So we have to re-earn their trust, but we also have to show what we could do now. I'm trying to talk about what we could do now. For example, on the rules of origin, like the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention. Negotiating the single market isn't an in or out thing. There's various different things about alignment.
So a Swiss-style deal.
But again, that would take a long period of time. Look, I've got businesses that are going to go to the wall now, right? I want to see what we can do now to help them start to trade again, because the conditions that Jacob and co have put together, and we haven't even begun to talk about the economic hit of the retained EU law bill, which is definitely your fault, Jacob, because you came up with this crazy dashboard of it.
It's fantastic.
Well, you're wearing it as a badge of honour.
Which is like pouring petrol into a fire. I mean, you know, most organisations have described it as another Kwasi Kwarteng Liz Truss special, because it is so reckless at this point in time when business is struggling to then tear up thousands and thousands of laws to create even more uncertainty about workers' rights, consumer rights, environmental protections.
This is why Sir Keir is right. We shouldn't rejoin the single market, because the single market is the regulatory form of the European Union which makes economy is inefficient.
But were you
It's a
surprised to
real-
see Jeremy Hunt answer Keir Starmer, arch Remainers, you could have said originally?
There is more joy in heaven over the one sinner who rejoiceth than over the 99 who aren't in need of repentance.
Thank
so
you
I'm
for that.
delighted by their endorsement of Brexit. But the retained EU law bill is one of the great Brexit benefits. It means we can have an efficient, competitive economy and get
But we haven't
rid
seen
of-
it yet.
We have seen
the
it,
bill
and
is
it's-
in
The bill, but we
Parliament.
haven't seen the evidence of it.
We've got the
nobody
list.
knows what it even covers. It's
Well,
absolutely
yes,
All right.
yes,
Well,
we
we
do. The website contains the rules that are
No, it
affected,
doesn't.
2,400 of them.
It's actually 4,000 and rising. Your own government admits you don't know all the laws that you're deleting
This
by
gives the
accident.
opportunity
All right, don't talk over each other.
to have a more efficient and competitive
All right,
economy.
listen,
It's
we've
really
tried
exciting.
to talk about the economy in terms of whether Brexit has boosted it or harmed it. But in terms of politics, Anita, is the political consensus and public opinion still there for Brexit? Because Sir John Curtis, psophologist, polling expert, cites a recent poll suggesting that 2 in 3 voters believe Brexit has gone badly. This is in The Independent. 65% of voters say EU withdrawal has gone badly. Do you think the politicians need to take notice of public opinion?
I think that focus groups are more valuable than polls in this kind of thing because, you know, do you feel positive about the economy? Probably right now most people would say no. Has Brexit gone badly for the economy? Most people would therefore say yes. I get the feeling that a lot of people don't feel hugely strongly about Brexit. And I think there's a group of people on either end that feel want to talk about it all the time or don't want to talk about it all the time. And everyone in the middle is basically like, yes, I will make a view and make a decision as and when I get asked about it. So I don't get the sense that it's an overriding priority for people. And therefore, because people feel negatively about the economy as a whole, they feel negatively about Brexit.
All right.
I don't think it's much more complicated than that.
I'm going to play a clip from the Labour MP Clive Lewis, who said on Politics Live here, sitting in Stella's seat last Wednesday, that the ultimate aim of Brexit was to deliver Trussonomics. Let's have a look.
One of the reasons I was so against Brexit wasn't for any particularly European identity ideological reasons. It was because I knew what was coming. And I think about Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. Well, they were coming. If they just rolled that pitch a little better...
You could predict Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng.
Well, the politics and the policies that they were going to... The massive tax giveaways that they were going to give to the wealthy, that's what partly Brexit was about.
Do you agree with that? You just said yes.
I think it was.
Could you see that coming? Is that what it was about?
No. Let's be careful about which bit I agree with. I think the whole point about, for some on the right of politics, their dream of Brexit was to have a deregulated, low-tax economy, kind of Singapore on Thames, but without the housing regulation that Singapore has, and nationalised land, which Singapore has, which they wouldn't want. But, you know, kind of deregulate the City of London, and that would create growth, low taxes, poor public services, and that's the direction that some of the Tory parties always wanted to go in. And that's what they saw Brexit as a step towards. Now, that's definitely true, but then there are others, including Jacob at one point and Nigel Farage, who said, well, actually, we might have a Swiss-style deal, we might have a Norwegian-style deal, which, of course, is partly in the EU, effectively. You're either in the customs union or the single market. The Swiss have got Schengen, so free movement. You know, they were floating that these ideas were still possible, but actually, when it came to it, I think Clive is right. They were pointing in more in that sort of free market, deregulatory territory, which is what Jacob's just said about this massive repeal of 4,000 laws, the deregulation from the single market. Now, of course, if you deregulate from the single market, what that means is you can't export your goods into the EU because they require higher standards. And actually what you see is we end up trading with other countries that have lower standards, which is why our farmers are up in arms with the Australia and New Zealand deal, because rightly Australia and New Zealand, which have massive agricultural economies, have said we want to be able to export our goods to Britain, therefore you need to lower your standards. And that's what Liz Truss has signed us up to.
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny in terms of forecast. Tony Blair, Anita said in 2017, the only circumstances in which Brexit works, and this is the fantasy of the real Brexiteers, they are in one sense right. Leave Europe. Britain should become a light touch, light regulation. The risk is the British people won't vote for that. They're not going to vote for the huge economic and social restructuring, to the changes to the health service and other things that would require. Was he right?
Well, the reality of the situation is that there are some things where we can regulate less. There are others where the public wouldn't want it. I think the financial services sector is a good example of where we have seen potential benefits that may come from the current legislation going through Parliament that could allow some more flexibility, that's allowed the financial services, which is a huge part of our economy, to remain competitive. There was a lot of doom and gloom about how the minute that we left the EU, you know, Frankfurt would overtake the UK. The UK has stayed in pretty much second place to New York. And I think there are some benefits that we're going to see. I just think this all or nothing way of thinking about Brexit doesn't actually lead to grown-up politics or grown-up policy making.
Except that's exactly what the retained EU law bill is doing. It's going to delete 4,000 laws. I sat on that committee, so I've gone through all those 4,000 laws such that we can find, because as I say, the government admits they don't know which laws it affects. They are clear that it affects your maternity rights, your paid holiday rights, your compensation right if your flight is delayed or your luggage is lost, the rules about whether there's chemicals in your cosmetics. The government is very clear that all of those rules need to be rethought, and the powers that it gives ministers, not Parliament, so it doesn't take back control to Parliament to decide what happens next. The only laws that they've already decided they're going to keep are about bird flu. So this government is literally for the birds. But your maternity rights, your working rights, your basic pension protections,
get you to respond in
they're happy to delete
But do you
them.
agree with Clive Lewis that this was always what Brexit was about? Tax cuts for the wealthy and deregulation in the way that you said it. Is that what it was?
The bill explicitly writes deregulation into law, so it says that the only things that can replace these laws in British laws, so this is not about the single market, have to be lower standards.
If that's the case, why did it all go so horribly wrong for Liz Truss?
Well, I think it's a misunderstanding anyway, but let's come to the retained EU law bill, because 1,400 extra regulations were found from the National Archive because they're not actually used. It's about making our laws suitable for the UK and our own laws. It's not about lowering standards. It's ensuring that they are our own domestic law in exactly the same way as they were brought in. They were brought in under secondary powers, they will be reformed under secondary powers. And we will help free up the economy as we do. But on the fundamental question, it was all about democracy. The British people can choose whether to have a Jeremy Corbyn government, if that's what they want to vote for, which actually within the EU would have been heavily constrained in what it did. And I always thought that it was right.
He wasn't that in favour of it, I don't think, was he, Jeremy Corbyn? I don't vote for it.
I was always happy, remain happy, to take the risk that people in the UK will vote for a hard left Labour government or will vote for a moderate Conservative government, and that government will be able to carry out its policies with a mandate from the people. That's democracy. I don't feel the need to have a supranational body who is protecting me from the hard left.
But in reality, when you do a trade deal with any other country, you compromise on your laws. You change your laws. We've changed our laws in light of the Australia-New Zealand deal. We didn't lower our farming standards or our import regulations before that. We did it because of that. But if you live in the real world, you have to adapt to what other countries want.
They can't change your laws for you, whereas the EU could override a decision of the UK
We chose
Parliament.
to join the EU. We've chosen to leave it as well, I accept. But we chose to join it, and therefore we had MEPs in the European Parliament. It was perfectly democratic. You can make an argument against
this. I'm
not relitigating it. I'm just saying you cannot say it was all undemocratic and now it's perfectly democratic.
And does sovereignty mean being worse off, perhaps, and that doesn't matter?
Well, I mean, it does matter that we enact the will of the British people, and they fundamentally said they wanted to leave. And I feel like all we've got to do now is decide how we're going to move forward. I guess my view in response to Andrew was specifically around the question of course you have to flex, but it's not all or nothing. You can have a deal with Australia, and it can be quite different to the relationship we have with the EU. And that can be seen as having more sovereignty in the UK.
As if we haven't had enough surprises this year in politics, in the mad, crazy year it has been with political upsets, a surprise that you might predict, I know you like forecasts, for 2023?
The surprise is that it's quiet. And the surprise is no more surprises after the last how many years have been a whirligig of political excitement. So at the end of the year, Rishi Sunak will be Prime Minister.
Not a comeback for Boris Johnson.
Jeremy Hunt will be Chancellor of the Exchequer. Suella Braverman will be Home Secretary, and King Charles will still be King.
What about you? A surprise? A political surprise for 2023? We've only got a few seconds and I've got to get the other two.
The surprise will be if Rishi Sunak gets through any of his big-ticket items at the same time, because if he wants to do the horrible things he wants to do to refugees and leave the ECHR, which Churchill set up, then he puts at risk the Good Friday Agreement, which puts at risk the Northern Ireland Protocol. This house of cards is going to fall down at some point. It's the British people are paying for it.
All right, well, that's the surprise. Political surprise for 2023?
I think Rishi Sunak will cave on public sector pay. I think you have to, because otherwise you won't resolve the problems in the NHS and elsewhere.
Take us to the end credits.
I'm going to predict possibly the end of the war in Ukraine.
The end of the war in Ukraine? Well,
maybe.
That's something to hope for. I said, careful what you wish for, but maybe on that, I'm agreed. That's all from Politics Live for 2022. We'll be back on January the 9th. Until then, have a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year. Bye-bye.